Most people don't truly grasp the length of eternity, often mixing it up with the idea of infinity. But from my own experience, eternity lasted exactly 15 years, 2 months, 27 days, and a few odd hours. It ended much like it began, with my wife, Ella, locking eyes with her partner and sharing a passionate kiss. Only this time I was that partner for the first time, and the kiss followed my proposal for her to be mine forever. On the night I gave her the engagement ring in a completely different setting, I found myself as a mere spectator in a restaurant, 2 towns over from where we lived, watching Ella with what appeared to be a new lover. They exchanged loving glances and leaned in for a kiss. How I ended up in the same restaurant as them doesn't really matter. The fact that it was an hour away from our town seemed like a deliberate choice to keep things discreet. At first, I was curious, but my emotions quickly shifted from intrigue to shock, disgust, and anger as I watched them. I briefly considered confronting them, but I'd always been taught never to hit a woman. So, I just sat there, dumbfounded, as they seemed completely absorbed in each other, feeling secure that no one who knew them would see. They ate slowly, engaging in occasional kissing games. I took my time, had dessert, and watched them. My emotions swung between fury and helplessness. After finishing their meal, they stood up, hand in hand, and left. There I was, sitting in a silence filled with rage, feeling like the biggest fool. I had been married to Ella for over 14 years, with 2 years of exclusive dating before that. Yet, I never suspected she was playing both sides. She'd never shown any interest in another woman, never dropped any hints during our conversations. I had believed I knew her better than anyone, convinced we'd grow old together. Learning about her infidelity, no matter the gender of her partner, was one thing, but it was her betrayal of the commitment we made when she accepted my ring that truly stung. It represented an eternity, seemingly forever. Who would have guessed that some eternities come with expiration dates? I paid the bill, got in my car, and drove home slowly. I had a lot to think about. Ella hadn't expected me home early from my trip, but luckily, I wrapped things up ahead of schedule. So, instead of coming back on Saturday afternoon as planned, I was heading home on Friday evening. I'd been gone since Monday, and while I missed Ella and the kids, the absence of closeness for more than 3 days had left me with a lot of pent-up energy that needed to be released. That is, until I saw what happened in the restaurant. I was only an hour from home and could have easily driven straight through. But since I was ahead of schedule, I decided to stop for a meal and take a break from driving. The rest, as they say, is history. Our kids are 12 and 10, old enough to stay home for the night if Ella wanted to go out, and I had no problem with that. But I couldn't help but wonder if they knew something was up, since neither of them had mentioned anything unusual. Maybe they were as clueless as I had been. Either way, I knew they wouldn't be thrilled with what I was about to do. On the drive home, I went through the usual cycle of self-doubt. What did I do wrong? How long had it been going on? At least I didn't have to worry about her lover being better endowed than me. I chuckled, thinking of myself. Dark humor, I guess. I walked in the door at 9, and Ella still wasn't home. My daughters, Tessa, 12, and Zoe, 10, greeted me warmly, but I couldn't really focus on them. I was too preoccupied, feeling nervous and uncertain about being home early. Ella, however, was a different story. About 2 hours later, she came in and must have noticed my car in the garage because she seemed to freshen up a bit. I could sense a change in her behavior, as she seemed less happy than she had in our earlier encounters. The first thing she asked was why I was home unexpectedly, and her tone suggested some concern. I tried to lighten the mood, teasing her a little about her greeting. But she, with a slight furrow in her brow, said that had she known I'd be back early, she would have prepared a nice dinner. Instead, she'd ordered pizza for the kids, and she and Sophie had gone out for wine and sandwiches downtown. Ella, avoiding my gaze, asked if I remembered Sophie from my office and if I'd heard her mention her before. I knew she wasn't being truthful, but I still nodded and said yes. Ella then, with a hint of sarcasm, described Sophie as a blonde with a large chest, making a joke about the trail of admirers she left in her wake. I couldn't help but think that Ella had the kind of presence that could assemble a football team just by walking into a room. And it wasn't just because she had a way of catching the attention of married women. Sophie, I used to tell myself, had the allure of a goddess. Her remarkable chest definitely didn't hurt. She was about 26, having started at the insurance company where Ella had worked the year before. The two of them hit it off immediately, and it seemed that, even at 39, Ella could still turn heads. She was also blonde, had a beautiful figure, and curves in all the right places. She was only 10 pounds heavier than when we first met, and while that might seem like a minor change, she still looked incredible. And until recently, that body was all mine. Despite the worried look on her face, Ella stayed calm. As for me, I could barely hold myself up, so I simply told her I was tired and going to bed. She gave me a quick peck on the lips as I passed her and made my way up the stairs. Maybe I was imagining things, but I was pretty sure I could taste the remnants of whatever love-making games had just taken place. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The kids went to bed before I did, and a few minutes later, I heard a quiet conversation. It was Ella on the phone with Sophie. The conversation didn't last long, and soon after, I heard her getting into the shower in our master bathroom. Either I had scared her enough that she dropped the act, or she thought I was too distracted to notice anything. Either way, my heart sank even further. The rest of the weekend was spent mostly without much interaction between Ella and me. Between the kids and household chores, there wasn't a lot of time for us to talk. Ella suggested we have a family dinner on Saturday night, but I told her I wasn't in the mood and walked out of the room, effectively ending the conversation. She must have sensed something was off since I'm rarely rude to her. On Monday morning at work, I asked my boss for a day off, citing personal issues. Max, my boss, knew a bit about my past, having gone through a divorce about 10 years ago and remarried 5 years ago, so he understood that something wasn't right in the Blake household. Given the success of my recent sales trip, he didn't hesitate when I asked for time off. As I was leaving his office, he handed me a business card. It was his divorce lawyer's card. He expressed his regret and sympathy for the situation with Ella. I acknowledged his words, saying that I, too, had always thought Ella and I would have a lasting connection. Acting on Max's advice, I sought legal counsel 2 days later. Although my lawyer could have taken a more professional approach, she showed genuine concern for my emotional state and offered gentle advice. She seemed surprised when I decided not to hire a private investigator to gather proof of Ella's infidelity. She looked at me with understanding as she explained that, in a no-fault state, such evidence wouldn't carry much weight. The real issue, she pointed out, would likely be the potential complications regarding visitation rights, though she was confident this wouldn't be a significant problem. Despite her calm demeanor, I couldn't handle being around Ella and the girls at home. Ella likely sensed the tension, given how little we were communicating. I'm sure the girls also noticed something wasn't right, picking up on the unusual silence in the house. I gave Ella multiple opportunities to talk, but she never took the chance. Things came to a head when Ella was served at work the following week. Call it petty if you want, but I wanted her to feel even a fraction of the pain I was going through. I think she was served around 11:03 a.m., because my phone started ringing off the hook at 11:05. I ignored all 15 calls from her and several from unfamiliar numbers, assuming she was using friends' phones to reach me. Strangely, for the first time since discovering her with Sophie, I felt a burst of energy. I was having an unexpectedly good day. Ella's car was already in the garage when I got home at 5:30. She didn't waste any time addressing the situation, expressing her fury about being served in front of her friends and colleagues. I stayed quiet until I got inside and set my things down. The girls were in the living room, engrossed in a movie on the big screen. I calmly told Ella that I'd made sure she was served in front of her mistress for her comfort. Ella's anger melted away, replaced by tears. I responded, asking how she could have been so careless with Sophie and why she hadn't been more discreet. I asked her 2 things. How long had this been going on, and when did she plan on telling me? She confessed it had been about 6 months, though she insisted they had planned to tell me soon. In less than 30 seconds, her demeanor shifted from fury to defeat. She stumbled toward the kitchen table and slumped into a chair. I walked over to the drinks cabinet, grabbed a bottle of Buffalo Trace bourbon, poured myself a double and sat down across from her. If looks could kill, she would have dropped dead in the first 2 seconds. I kept my gaze on her, and she couldn't tear her eyes away from the table. I quietly asked how I hadn't noticed her betrayal after all this time. She told me that she had only recently discovered it about herself. She insisted it hadn't been planned. It had just happened. Finally, she looked up at me and held my gaze, telling me it shouldn't change anything between us. Ella said she still loved me and needed to explore this new side of herself. She asked for my support and more time to figure it out, saying it was her turn now. I was in shock, and I asked if 6 months wasn't enough time for her to explore. I reminded her that if she truly loved me, she would honor our vows and not even consider such an exploration. I told her I believed fidelity went beyond gender, and that she shouldn't have entertained the idea at all. Ella countered, saying that true love could forgive a mistake. I argued that one mistake could be forgiven, but 6 months showed a conscious decision. I was frustrated and told her that love shouldn't give her the right to tear my heart out and put our family at risk. I insisted that her actions had nothing to do with gender. She called me self-centered, retorting that it had everything to do with girls and accusing me of just complaining. I snapped back, telling her that she was turning into garbage right before my eyes and questioning whether she even loved me anymore. I said it felt like she loved me like a pet, not a man. I accused her of being in love with the other woman, pointing out that I had been pushed to second place. When she denied it, I shouted at her to stop, telling her I knew exactly what I had seen and that I knew her better than anyone else. She looked guilty, and it suddenly hit her. She realized I had seen them together. Even though Ella quickly tried to smooth things over, I couldn't shake the fact that she loved someone else, someone who wasn't me. I told her that if it had been another man, at least I could confront him directly. Ella asked if we could be civil, and I hesitated, acknowledging the painful truth that she had fallen in love with a woman who had essentially stolen my wife from me. A few months down the line, I learned that the kids had no idea about Ella's affair. They thought Aunt Sophie was just a close family friend. They had noticed the occasional quick kiss and tender touch between them. But since Aunt Sophie wasn't a man, they didn't think there was anything wrong. I found out about it one evening when the kids and I went out to dinner. They mentioned how Aunt Sophie had been spending more time at the house since I moved out. It seemed they'd pieced together that Aunt Sophie was part of the reason Ella and I were getting a divorce. Since we lived in a no-fault divorce state, our finances were split right down the middle. I was ordered to pay child support and Ella got the house. I moved into an apartment about 15 minutes away from the family home, and I was completely devastated. Ella and I kept in touch through the girls, who were involved in all kinds of activities, both school-related and otherwise. We did our best to show them that we would continue to support them as much as possible. For reasons I couldn't fully understand, Ella fought tooth and nail against the divorce, and it dragged on for a full year before it was finalized. Whenever I ran into Ella and Sophie at the girls' parties, I remained polite but nothing more. For family gatherings, I was always invited, but knowing Ella would be there, I'd apologize and slip away as quickly as possible. I knew I was sacrificing precious family memories, but it took everything in me to keep my composure whenever she and Sophie were around. I spent solo days with the kids, giving them their birthday and Christmas presents. As expected, we all kept the friends we had before we married. Almost all of the people we met after the marriage stuck with Ella, as one of the husbands later explained to me. Many of them felt uncomfortable around me, especially since I had lost my wife to another woman. The general sentiment seemed to be that I somehow deserved what had happened, and some of our married female friends even seemed to suggest just that. I let them go without putting up a fight because, as the old saying goes, you truly learn who your real friends are during tough times. By my own choice, I didn't date much in the years that followed. My heart wasn't ready, and I wasn't interested in opening up to anyone. After a year of solitude, I went to a local animal shelter and adopted a German Shepherd, probably about 3 years old. I specifically asked the shelter staff to show me the 3 dogs that had been there the longest. The one I chose had been there since he was a playful pup, but after being rejected time and again, he had become quiet and withdrawn, with the saddest eyes I'd ever seen on an animal. I felt like we were kindred spirits, both of us rejected in our own ways. The dog's name was Ethan, Not some cute or fancy name, just Ethan. Ethan had me and I had him. The first thing he did when I brought him into my apartment was sniff around, then climb onto the couch next to me and curl up beside me. He was great with the girls when they visited on the weekends, but I think Ethan preferred it when it was just the two of us. He loved going for walks and riding in the car with me. We would talk about almost anything, though Ethan mostly stayed silent during our conversations. I could tell by the way he looked at me, ears perked up, eyes focused, that he was listening to every word. A few years later, my eldest daughter, Tessa, met a guy from Boston while in college and got married. Since my engineering career was going well, I was able to give her the wedding of her dreams. Walking her down the aisle was one of the proudest moments of my life, but after the ceremony, I was reprimanded by Tessa for messing up my one line. I realized my mistake during the rehearsal, but in the heat of the moment, my voice cracked. When I was asked who was giving her away, I answered with a simple "I," instead of the more appropriate "her mother and I." I had almost choked on the words. As I sat down next to Ella in the front row, she leaned in close and quietly muttered that it was disgusting, and I knew it. Sophie, sitting beside Ella, leaned forward and shot me a bold, defiant glare. I responded silently, mouthing a "forget it," while quickly scanning the room to see if the pastor had noticed our brief exchange. Wedding ceremonies always stir up memories for me, and for a moment, I found myself reminiscing fondly about my own wedding day. That warm feeling lasted all of about 30 seconds before my mind wandered to the moment I discovered Ella and Sophie together in that restaurant. As I snapped back to reality, I saw Ella's eyes on me, her expression filled with sadness. She blushed, quickly looking away. Maybe I wasn't the only one lost in the past. Though I didn't intentionally observe them, it was hard not to notice how much fun Ella and Sophie seemed to be having, surrounded by Lee, AA, Jerry, and practically everyone else. It was then that I realized I was one of the few people over 50 in the room who wasn't attached to anyone. A wave of self-pity hit me, and I made my way to the open bar, ordering a shot of 18-year-old Irish whiskey. Taking the drink, I sat down at my table, offering myself a small pat on the back for throwing such a grand event. 3 years later, I found myself preparing to play the father of the bride role again when my youngest, Zoe, got married. This time, I wasn't going to do it alone. I made an active decision to try meeting new people. After returning from a 3-day business trip out of state, I stopped by a small bar restaurant about an hour from my apartment. Normally, I'd avoid these places because of my aversion to country western music, but the promise of some good pork barbecue drew me in. The food was incredible, and by the time the DJ started playing music around 8 p.m., I decided to scope the room for any potential conversation partners. That's when she walked in. A 30-year-old black woman with the most angelic face I'd ever seen. She was striking, and I couldn't help but wonder why a young, unmarried woman would be at the bar at this hour. Meanwhile, there I was, just another lonely, old white guy. I figured she was probably too young for me, but against my better judgment, I motioned to the bartender to put her drinks on my tab. He passed the message along, and to my surprise, she walked over to my table to thank me. I invited her to sit, and she did, introducing herself as Jade. We spent the evening chatting, and before I knew it, she suggested going back to her place. I was caught off guard, but before I could say anything, a man in a cowboy hat approached and kissed her on the cheek. I froze. Jade reassured me, introducing him as her husband, Fred. She then asked if he could join us, and Fred grinned, mentioning how they were both involved. I raised my hands, feeling uncomfortable, and made it clear that something didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was one messed up situation, so I excused myself and left alone, heading back to my car. In my ongoing search for companionship, I turned to someone from church, Carrie, a 50-year-old divorcee with long black hair, a 34B chest, long legs, and a radiant smile. We hit it off, going on a few dates before things got more intimate. But during one of those encounters, she began calling out her ex-husband Jim's name in the middle of it. Caught me off guard, and the situation escalated when she screamed it again. I immediately stopped, explaining that I wasn't Jim. Carrie didn't take kindly to this, expressing genuine frustration over why I'd stopped. Without another word, I drove her home, and needless to say, there wasn't a fifth date. My next attempt at dating was with a coworker, Rachel Webb, a 42-year-old divorcee who had separated from her husband almost 5 years ago. She was a blonde with a slightly fuller figure than average, and we'd been friends at work for over 10 years. By now, she'd heard my story, and I knew hers. After a series of great evenings together, we genuinely enjoyed each other's company, and eventually we took our friendship to a more intimate level. Looking forward to another wedding, I invited Rachel to be my date. She hesitated at first, unsure about coming with me, considering the complicated dynamics with my ex-wife. I jokingly said that she'd need approval from Ethan, my 45-pound German Shepherd mix, who, I explained, would only allow her to accompany me if he approved. Rachel laughed and called me strange, but a week later, after passing Ethan's test, she agreed to come. The girls were thrilled that I wouldn't be going solo, but Ella, predictably, was not happy about this arrangement. She shot me disgruntled looks throughout the event, and though I didn't engage much with her, it bothered Rachel, who could sense Ella's disapproval of her. At the rehearsal dinner, I found Ella sitting alone and seized the moment to finally confront her. I asked her what her problem was. With a sharp edge to her voice, Ella sarcastically dismissed Rachel, wondering if I was now dating Girl Scouts. I couldn't help but point out that her jealousy was becoming pretty obvious, and I reminded her that Rachel, Ella, and Sophie were all the same age. I added, half-jokingly, that Ella had swapped me out for a younger, female version of herself. To my surprise, Ella responded with a shy grace that caught me off guard. A year later, Rachel became my second wife and life moved on. The details of our life together began to blur into a comfortable routine. One day, however, I was at work when I got a call that caught me off guard. I had completely forgotten that I was even on the bone marrow registry, but after 30 years, they told me that I was a match for someone. The thought of being able to help someone live was exciting, even though the extraction process was going to be a bit inconvenient. But honestly, I had always felt that rush of wanting to be a hero, so I agreed to go ahead with the procedure. I knew further testing was required, and if all went well, the extraction would be scheduled just 2 weeks after my consent. I told them I was all in. While I'm not overly religious, I do believe in God, and there's an old saying that God works in mysterious ways. I didn't think much about that until just a few days later when I was on the phone with my oldest daughter, Tessa. During our usual chat, I kept the subject of Ella's life at arm's length, but Tessa casually mentioned that bone marrow had been found for Aunt Sophie, and they were already preparing for the procedure. I sent my best wishes through Tessa, telling her to pass them along to Sophie and Ella, even though my feelings were still complicated. Despite everything, I didn't want harm to come to them. Tessa told me that as an adult I could call them directly, but I explained that it was better for me to keep my distance. The less I spoke to them, the less chance I had of saying something I'd regret later. Tessa then urged me to let go of the past, reminding me that I had been happily married to Rachel for almost 2 years. I admitted that while I no longer hated Ella, she wasn't exactly someone I wanted to connect with, especially not on social media. Still, I decided to send Ella a bouquet with a note, offering my well wishes. As I placed the order for the flowers, something nagged at me. Bone marrow matches are incredibly rare, and the timing seemed too perfect. Sophie had found a match, and I had been notified around the same time. It made me wonder if there was more to this than pure coincidence. I knew that the donation process was supposed to be anonymous, but I called my contact at the registry, pretending to remain hopeful, and asked if it was possible my match lived in the same city. She hesitated, then admitted this was the first time a match had reached out before the procedure. My suspicion grew, and the frustration set in as I realized the person I was matched with was none other than Ella. Couldn't believe it. Ella, the woman who had stolen my wife, never apologized, and now she was expecting me to save her life. I was livid. I made up my mind that I wasn't going through with it. 2 days later, I called the receptionist back and told her I was refusing to donate. She was almost in tears when I said it, and after a moment of stunned silence, she asked if there was any particular reason for my decision. She explained that while it was my right to refuse, It was a rare decision, and it would cause quite a stir at the registry. I apologized for the inconvenience but stood firm. She mumbled an apology and told me that if I changed my mind, I should call back immediately. When I told Rachel that I had backed out of the donation, she was furious. I didn't mention that I had figured out who the recipient was. She only knew that I had refused to help save someone's life. Rachel was livid, practically shouting at me. She couldn't understand why, after all my talk about wanting to help, I would turn my back now. It was the first time I had heard Rachel use strong language, and in that moment, I decided to be completely honest with her. I explained that I never wanted to inform Ella or Sophie about the donation if I had a choice. I wouldn't be doing it for them, and I wouldn't let my past with them influence my decision to help someone else. Rachel didn't take it well, accusing me of denying Sophie a chance at life out of spite. I tried to make her understand that it wasn't about revenge but about protecting myself from a situation that had already hurt me too much. Rachel asked if they knew about her involvement, and I reassured her that everything was handled anonymously. I only found out about it by sheer luck. As I said this, Rachel's expression softened a little. She argued that I couldn't just refuse the opportunity to save a life, stressing how heavy it was to have Sophie's life literally in my hands. She whispered that I was too good a person to turn my back, warning that the guilt would eventually eat away at me. I disagreed, telling her I wouldn't feel guilty because Sophie and Ella had both shattered my heart. I made it clear that they would never know it was me who could have helped them. Rachel expressed her concerns, mentioning the hope they had for the bone marrow and how my decision might have crushed it. As the conversation continued, it seemed like we were drifting further apart. Our differences were more apparent than ever, and the tension was growing. At one point, she asked about my Christian charity, to which I shot back, questioning whether I should just blindly give money to someone who could potentially hurt me. She called me ridiculous. I responded, explaining that neither Sophie nor Ella had torn out my heart and upended my life the way they had. I told her that I wasn't just going to shrug off everything that happened between us and help them, as if the past didn't matter. After 17 years, I reminded her that Ella had been married to Sophie longer than she had been married to me, so maybe she should deal with it. Rachel insisted that they had made a choice, and I quietly replied that they could either live or not. Either way, it wasn't my concern anymore. A few days later, on a Saturday afternoon, I told Rachel I was heading to the range to blow off some steam. She reminded me to be back before dinner, as the girls were coming over, and I'd need to shower before we ate so I wouldn't smell like gunpowder. I spent a good chunk of time at the range, unloading 500 rounds into the target with my 9mm. Whitefish, I don't know why, but shooting always has this calming effect on me. I think it's because when you're concentrating so hard, you're forced to focus only on the task at hand. After a while, your body just relaxes, almost like it's taking a break. When I got home, I definitely smelled like gunpowder, so I went straight to the shower. I glanced at the dining table, set for 6, with the smell of roast wafting through the air. Rachel is a great cook, and I hoped she'd made those little brown potatoes I love instead of the usual mashed potatoes. After showering, I poured myself a glass of rye whiskey and brought Ellie a glass of wine. She seemed a little nervous, which I chalked up to wanting the dinner to be perfect for the girls and their husbands. I kissed her on the lips as a way of reassuring her. I was in the living room, reading on the computer when the door opened. It wasn't the girls and their husbands, though. It was Ella and a disheveled-looking Sophie. I wasn't happy to see them, and I shot Rachel a look as I stood up to greet everyone. I kissed the girls but didn't acknowledge my ex or Sophie. I noticed that Ella and Sophie greeted Rachel with what could only be described as enthusiasm. There was a lot of whispering going on, too. I wasn't born yesterday, so I immediately knew that Rachel had set up this little intervention. Actually, it felt more like an ambush, considering I was the only one who hadn't known about it. For a moment, I thought about just grabbing my phone and leaving, but then I decided it was time to speak my mind. At first, though, I had to sit through the excuse that this was just a nice family dinner. The main topic of conversation was Sophie's illness, though I didn't engage in it. I sat with what I hoped was a thoughtful expression on my face while everyone else carried on. I couldn't tell you much about the dinner or dessert. Honestly, my mind wasn't on the food. As the good host, I made sure everyone had their drinks, and then we all moved into the living room. After a brief silence, I decided it was time to speak up. I asked who would be the first to speak. The woman who had betrayed my trust to set up this meeting, the woman who had broken my heart years ago and now thought I owed her a favor, or perhaps the woman who had taken a married woman away from her unsuspecting husband and now needed help to survive. As I spoke, I made sure to look at each face in turn. None of the women could meet my gaze. Rachel's face lit up when I called her name, but it was my eldest daughter, Tessa, who took the lead. She acknowledged my lingering anger toward my ex-wife and Aunt Sophie but told me that my refusal to donate bone marrow was childish and petty. She said it was beneath me. Tessa argued that denying someone a chance at life, simply out of spite, was wrong. She pointed out that this wasn't just some petty act, like throwing a whipped cake in someone's face. It was about a person's life, something far more serious. I took a sip of rye whiskey and cleared my throat, shaking my head slightly. I couldn't help but feel frustrated, and I told her that every action comes with consequences. I reminded her that Ella and Sophie had never anticipated the fallout from their choices, but now they were trying to make their problems mine. I saw this as an unexpected chance to right something in my own life, even if it meant making a painful decision. While they might see it as an act of vengeance, I saw it as a way to reclaim my dignity. After all, how could I feel any respect for myself if I helped the man who took my wife from me? And let's be honest here. Do you all think I should be more sympathetic towards Sophie just because she's a woman? If her name were Carl and he were a 200-pound guy, most of you would probably think I had every right to do what I'm doing. But it doesn't matter to me that Sophie's a woman. She's a homewrecker, plain and simple. She knew exactly what she was doing when she betrayed me. Sophie was quiet, her eyes glued to the carpet. Ella, sitting beside her, reached over and gently took her hand. I said again that my decision wasn't driven by revenge. It was rooted in my hatred for Sophie. I hated her. There was no way I was going to help her, not after everything. I had barely spoken to her in all the 17 years she spent with Ella, and I wasn't about to change that now. Ella sniffled, tears threatening to fall, and asked if I really hated her that much. If I was willing to take away Sophie's chance at life. She tried to appeal to my past love for her, claiming it would be an honorable thing to do. I scoffed, telling her that I didn't see honor in her actions. I reminded her she was nothing more than a mistress, and she had no right to lecture me on honor. I could feel my anger building, and I was doing everything I could not to shout at all of them, including Rachel, to just go to hell and leave me alone. I took a few deep breaths, but before I could say anything, Rachel stepped in, quietly reminding me that I was a good person who always did the right thing. She told me I couldn't back down, that I would never forgive myself if I did. Tessa quickly chimed in, saying that I had always taught them to do what was right, even when it seemed hard. I paused, acknowledging that point, but I told them that my decision was about making sure I wouldn't regret it later. And then Sophie spoke up, her voice breaking, asking me not to let her die. She acknowledged what she had done to me, but she begged me to consider the grim reality she faced. If I didn't donate my bone marrow, her chances of survival were slim. Her eyes, wide and filled with desperation, locked onto mine. I could see how much it cost her to ask, but I wasn't moved. I didn't feel any satisfaction in saying no, but I said it anyway. No, that was all I said. I didn't offer an apology because, frankly, I wasn't sorry. I wasn't going to lift a finger to help her. Sophie took it better than Ella, who broke down into sobs. Rachel rushed over to comfort them, whispering, "I'll try. I'll talk to him." But in her haste, she didn't realize the damage she was doing to our marriage. She didn't see how much this was chipping away at our trust. I grabbed the car keys off the hook and walked out of the house. I didn't look back as 5 women cried behind me. I didn't return for 3 days. I ignored the dozens of calls from Rachel and the kids. When I finally came home, the house was dark and quiet. It was clear that Rachel had packed up and gone somewhere else for a while. Some clothes were gone, but everything else seemed untouched. I grabbed my suitcase and packed what I needed, most of my clothes and whatever else I could carry. I left my wedding ring sitting in the middle of the kitchen table. 3 days later, while I was at work, I received an anonymous call, which, to my surprise, turned out to be Rachel. She was in disbelief that our marriage had come to an end simply because I refused to be, in her words, the biggest idiot in the world. I told her, with equal astonishment, that I was shocked to have been married to someone who had so thoroughly betrayed my trust. I suggested that, instead of us both trying to fix things, maybe it was time for us to accept the reality of the situation. If anyone was out for revenge, it certainly wasn't me. Maybe it was something bigger than either of us. I even referenced the biblical saying, "Vengeance is mine, says the Lord." I didn't hold back, pointing out that her actions had been unforgivable and adding that, frankly, she really sucked. 2 months after our official divorce, Sophie passed away. I found out through the local newspaper obituary. I hadn't been keeping track of her situation, and none of my daughters had kept me in the loop. Despite the strained relationship I had with them after everything that happened, I stood firm in my decision not to help Sophie. None of us had backed down. I knew deep down that I had made the right choice. I never lost a moment of sleep over refusing to give Sophie my bone marrow. The bone marrow registry wasn't very understanding of my personal situation and took me off their list, but I didn't care. The chances of finding a match for me were slim anyway. Ethan, on the other hand, was always a bit moody, and he wasn't exactly thrilled about any of the women I'd been seeing over the past year or so. But that didn't really bother me. At 62, I wasn't exactly looking for wife number 3. To my surprise, I was still getting plenty of attention. I learned that at my age, there were way more eligible women than there were men, and if a woman was healthy, there was a good chance she'd be up for a night of fun. Of course, neither of us wanted to go overboard with youthfulness, as neither of us was in the business of breaking a hip. But more often than not, we both enjoyed some good company. I jokingly referred to my companions as my handsome old singletons. It had been over 4 years since I'd spoken to anyone in my family when my youngest, Zoe, called to inform me that Ella had passed away a few days ago. She thought I should know and invited me to the funeral. We had shared 15 years together and had 2 kids, so I figured I owed it to myself to show up. Maybe this would be my chance to repair my relationship with my daughters. I sat in the back, alone, as the service went on. It was a nice ceremony, but afterwards, I approached my daughters and their families. I was greeted with shy hugs from the girls, firm handshakes from their husbands, and hesitant nods from my 3 grandchildren. We all went to a nearby restaurant afterward to talk, but it only took 3 minutes before the first bombshell was dropped. Tessa, without warning, asked why Aunt Sophie had been allowed to die. I sighed, acknowledging that not much had changed in our relationship over the past 4 years. I reminded her that Sophie had been a thief of my wife, and this would be the last time we would discuss it. I changed the subject by pointing out a young man sitting at the bar. I jokingly proposed a scenario where he kissed Tessa. Jerry, without hesitation, said he'd deal with him, and when I asked what he'd do if it were an affair, he quickly responded that the man would already be dead. I made the comparison, telling him that, since the man would be dead, Jerry wouldn't have to worry about donating bone marrow if he fell ill. Jerry agreed, and I followed up by saying that I hadn't helped Sophie partly because she was a woman, but maybe that had been a mistake. I added that I shouldn't have helped the man who had been involved with my wife or the one who had stolen her from me. Jerry nodded, and I could see a realization dawn on him. His eyes scanned the room, and I could tell that everyone in the group was beginning to understand. I quietly shared that I wasn't proud of my decision, but I wasn't ashamed either. Sophie didn't deserve my compassion after taking away the love of my life. Zoe, her voice filled with confusion, asked how I could withhold compassion if I had once loved her mother. I admitted that, yes, I had loved her mother deeply, but when she shattered my heart, a lot of that love had turned to hate. I wasn't the monster her mother had painted me as. I told her that things hadn't gone well for Ella, that karma had caught up with her and with Sophie. As I spoke, I noticed the tears welling up in the eyes of the other adults in the room, while my grandchildren looked on, bewildered and anxious. I knew it would take time for all of us to process everything, so I suggested that we try not to get stuck in the past. Life moves forward, and we had to do the same.